Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Columbina guide. Columbina the Moon Goddess is the newest 5-star Hydro character who was just released in version Luna 4. And so in today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Columbina, covering what she does, her best builds, artifacts, weapons, teams, constellations, and much more. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and do note that some of the footage you're seeing here is from the Creator Experience server, where I got to record some gameplay of Columbina early, allowing me to get you guys this guide out faster. Now in the future, I still want to try to be quicker, but a lot of time and effort went into it, so I hope it's appreciated. With that said, let's get right into it. Alright, so starting things off, let's talk about what Columbina actually does so that you can understand and get the most value out of her. Well, firstly, as the Moon Goddess and kind of pseudo Archon of the region, Columbina naturally synergizes and revolves around the lunar reactions. In fact, Columbina even has a passive talent that will convert any electrocharge, bloom, and hydrocrystallize reactions into their lunar equivalents, so lunar charge, lunar bloom, and the new lunar crystallize, provided you have her in your party. Now, while I've covered lunar charge and lunar bloom in past videos, lunar crystallize is a new reaction that turns hydrocrystallize, which is a reaction that does no damage, into one that actually does. Lunar crystallize will generate 3 moon drifts, which are considered geoconstructs, which is nice for certain characters like Shiori, that will each fire off a hit of damage after you trigger 3 lunar crystallizes. These pillars will like resonate and do damage, and that is a new reaction that will be a nice amount of bonus damage in any geo team you put Columbina in. Now, obviously, we're gonna get a lunar crystallize carry on the second half of this patch, but regardless, she does enable all of the lunar reactions that are currently in the game. Oh, and also I wanted to mention that regarding lunar crystallize, the damage is calculated similarly to lunar charge in that it's a reaction that can crit, and also all of your party members that are involved in the reaction do have their damage factored into the reaction following the formula you're seeing on screen. Also, while lunar charge and lunar crystallize are good sources of damage that will factor in the stats of everyone involved, lunar bloom is a reaction that, if you didn't watch my Nefer or Llama videos where I explain it in more detail, basically is a reaction that acts the same way as bloom, produces the same dendro core, but it will also give you a verdant dew, and the reaction itself won't actually do anything different other than generate this dew for you. It won't do more damage or anything like that, but the verdant dew can be used by certain characters like Nefer, Llama, or Columbina, and all of the sources of lunar bloom damage you will be doing will come from direct lunar bloom talent damage from these same characters, and those can be very strong. Same with like direct lunar charge and direct lunar crystallize, some talents, some abilities that do damage of this reaction. But I did just want to clarify here that the lunar bloom reaction itself doesn't really do anything different other than generate this dew, and I realize I'm saying dew a lot, so I hope it wasn't too confusing. On top of that though, Columbina does buff these reactions quite a bit. Firstly, through the same passive talent, she will increase the base damage of all of these lunar reactions by up to 7%, scaling with her max HP and capping out at 35,000 HP, where you get this 7% to each reaction. On top of just that though, Columbina will also increase the damage of your lunar reactions through her elemental burst, which summons a lunar domain. Through this hydro domain expansion that she does, if your active character is inside the lunar domain, then your entire party will have their lunar reaction damage increased by up to 40% at talent level 10. On top of that, her elemental burst, outside of just having a beautiful animation, will also do an initial hit of hydro damage. That is a nice bonus, but it's primarily used for this big reaction damage buff that you're getting to all lunar reactions. And Columbina's burst has a 20-second duration with a 15-second cooldown, so over 100% uptime, with a 60 energy cost. Now, on top of just that, one of Columbina's Ascension passives will also give her an additional buff to each specific lunar reaction after you use your elemental burst and are inside of the lunar domain. In fact, for lunar charge and lunar crystallize, there will be a 33% chance to effectively get another hit, so either an additional lightning strike from your thundercloud or an additional moon drift from each pillar, whereas with lunar bloom, it's actually completely different, and Columbina will gain a new type of dew that's called Moonridge Dew. Now, you can have up to 3 of these dews, and they're calculated separately from the regular verdant dew, and they will also be consumed after verdant dew if you have both of them available at the same time. Now, while this may seem weird, what this means in practice is that in Nefer teams where sometimes you're struggling to get your dew on time if, say, you're dash canceling everything perfectly, and in optimal rotations you'd have to use your burst not for the damage of the burst in particular, but actually to kind of do something while waiting in between your animations for more dews to be generated. Well, with this Moonridge Dew, you'll actually have more than enough now to no longer really have to wait on Nefer, and even be able to use Lauma's hold skill during your rotation. Basically, it's just more dew, a new type of dew. You get 3 extra ones that can really make some rotations with Lauma or Nefer a lot smoother. Columbina herself does also have a way of consuming these dews, which is mostly only relevant if you use her as a main DPS, but we'll cover that shortly. Now, outside of that, another very important part of Columbina's kit is actually her elemental skill. Her elemental skill, Eternal Tides, will summon a gravity ripple, which is basically just a hydro rain ring that will follow your active character even if Columbina is off field. This will constantly deal AoE hydro damage, doing 1 hit every 2 seconds. Additionally, as you trigger lunar reactions while your elemental skill is active, Columbina will gain 20 gravity up to once every 2 seconds. Once Columbina has 60 gravity, Columbina will deal a special hit of damage that actually won't be hydro. This special hit will deal lunar reaction damage based on whichever lunar reaction you triggered the most, which lunar reaction accumulated the most gravity for Columbina. If it was lunar charge, you'll do an instance of lunar charge damage. Lunar crystallize, you'll do an instance of lunar crystallize damage. And if it's lunar bloom, you'll do 5 smaller hits of lunar bloom damage. Although it is worth noting that all 5 of these hits can be buffed by Lauma's quill equivalent, so it'll oftentimes add up to not being actually smaller. But yeah, basically every 6 seconds you'll do either lunar charge, lunar bloom, or lunar crystallize damage on top of your normal hydro that you're doing every 2 seconds. This ability is really nice. It's consistent hydro application and damage from off field. And do note that the lunar reaction damage that you will be doing in practice will be surprisingly high. It definitely adds up, and it's more than you might expect from just looking at the talent numbers because of the way that direct lunar reaction talent damage is calculated. Outside of that, you should note that this ability lasts for a long time. It has a 25-second duration with a 17-second cooldown, and Columbina's damage, both through her skill and also her elemental burst hit, do scale with her max HP. Something else I want to mention about her elemental skill though is actually the last passive talent we have to talk about, which will give her up to 15% crit rate. The exact way it works is that every time you do that big hit called gravity interference through your elemental skill, Columbina will gain 5% crit rate for 10 seconds. And so while it will take a little bit to ramp up from 5 to 10 to 15%, because your skill has 100% uptime, eventually this will just end up being a free 15% crit rate that you should factor into your build. I also wanted to mention that Columbina as a hydro catalyst can do hydro infused normal attacks, but also has a special charge attack if you have verdant dews, meaning if you're lunar blooming, that will consume a verdant dew instead of stamina to deal 3 instances of AoE dendro damage that is considered lunar bloom damage. Because of this, Columbina can actually be a viable main DPS, most notably with Lauma, where you can use your charge attacks from on field and be a dedicated carry in that way. It's a team that definitely can work, so we'll also cover this playstyle and way of building Columbina in this video on top of her more standard supportive one. And this charge attack also scales with HP, and the lunar bloom reaction damage, like direct lunar bloom damage, can actually crit, so HP and crit will influence it as far as stats that you can build on Columbina, but more on that a bit later in the video. Lastly, regarding Columbina's talent priority, honestly both her skill and burst are really important and similar in strength provided you are using your burst. For those reasons, I would level both your skill and burst at least at talent level 9 as high as you can because they do add up quite a bit. Her skill will be better for her personal damage, and her burst will give your team that lunar reaction damage buff. So yeah, level both. Lastly, for her normal attacks, you can either ignore this as they support Columbina or level it if you're playing her as an on-field DPS, notably if you're using her unique charge attacks. I also want to mention that leveling Columbina all the way up to 90 does go a long way because she does scale on HP, so that is something you should do as well. And so Columbina is a character who does quite a bit. Through her elemental skill, she'll deal very solid off-field personal damage through the hydro hits and also the lunar reaction hits that she'll get from her gravity ripple, which really does add up to being great off-field damage. On top of that, she can buff not only her own reaction damage, but also your entire team's lunar reaction damage by 40% through her burst and another 7% through a passive of hers. Additionally, her burst will also give lunar crystallize, lunar charge, and lunar bloom an extra effect, which is always great and super convenient for the extra dew in lunar bloom in particular, but she's obviously great for every lunar reaction. Columbina gives you pretty solid and consistent off-field hydro application, which is always nice and makes her usable in more teams than you might expect. Now, as far as playstyles go, she is very simple, although there are a few different ways to play her. Now, the general way to play her will be as a strong sub DPS in lunar reaction focused teams, where you use her skill and burst and then swap out and don't have to think about her much more. Now, in some teams, it is possible to burst every other rotation if you don't have enough energy recharge, but this will depend on the team, but more on that later. Columbina can also be used as a main DPS thanks to her charge attacks that will consume verdant dew provided you can generate them, so with a dendro support. And while this will work even without Llama, it is a lot better with her, so that's mostly when I'd recommend it. Whereas outside of that, she can still be an on-fielder in some other teams and can still be played alongside a different dendro, but in that case she will be a lot worse than with Llama, and I'd more recommend her as a sub DPS and support, where she has some of the most powerful meta teams right now. Note that as a DPS with a dendro support, Columbina's playstyle is very straightforward. You can use your skill and burst on Columbina and all of your support characters, cycling through them before swapping back to your Columbina and consuming all of your dew to do your enhanced lunar bloom charge attacks. As far as actually pull value goes and when she becomes a very considerable meta upgrade is going to be in the teams with someone else who specializes in lunar reactions, most notably another Nodcry 5-star like Flynn's, Nefer, Lauma, or Inefa, or even even ZIBAI. But as far as more of a meta review and my thoughts on her and her power level, do check out my last video for that because I don't want to repeat myself here. If you are wondering though, I do think Columbina is incredibly powerful, especially if you already have one other Nodcry 5-star, being able to make almost any team meta with Inefa. Columbina and Inefa might be the strongest wheelchair duo in the game. They're truly incredible and can elevate any team or any carry to basically meta levels of DPS, while also elevating the lunar carries like Flynn's, Nefer, and eventually ZIBAI to effectively the top teams in the Nodcry meta. Obviously though, her exact pull value varies heavily based on your account, so again, check out my last video for more information. Don't feel forced to pull her, but her exact value for you will go up if you have some of these Nodcry characters, and it goes down if not, but she can still be used as just a generic off-field Hydro character if you want to and like her. Now for some other tips I want to mention, here's what you should know. Firstly, if you are running Columbina with another Nodcry character and you are in Ascendant Gleam and are triggering lunar reactions, so the most notable example would be like with Columbina and Inefa, or even Lauma, then whoever your on-field character is in that team can be in the Night of the Skies Unveiling set. While this is obviously going to be a no-brainer for a Nodcry DPS or even a main DPS Columbina, if you are playing, for example, Columbina and Inefa with a random DPS from a different region, you can still put them on Night Sky because of the fact that you're constantly going to be lunar charging through your other characters, even if your on-field character isn't, and they still will, through the way the set works, get the full 30% crit rate and 80 elemental mastery from the Night Sky set. This will be a great choice if you don't have a better set option for that carry, which a lot of the times will be the case because of the fact that it's a lot of stats, making it really viable on whoever your on-fielder is. Additionally, in some teams, if you don't have an on-fielder, it's also possible to like give it to Columbina if you spend time on her on-field, so if you on-field your Columbina, but generally, Night Sky can work on a DPS if you are triggering lunar reactions, and if you are in Ascendant Gleam, it'll still work without Ascendant Gleam, you'll just get less crit rate, but yeah, mainly for those specific team comps. Lastly, I wanted to mention another tip regarding DPS Columbina, and it's just that you can dash cancel your charge attacks a bit early in the animation. Now, I'm probably not doing it perfectly here, but if you want to, you can cancel it a bit early and save some time there. All right, now with all that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Columbina, starting with her artifact sets. Now, for Columbina's artifact sets, there are a few, mainly two, options that are really good for her. The first one is going to be Silken Moon Serenade as a standard supportive set that works in basically any lunar reaction team. This is because you'll get 20% ER on the two-piece, which is nice for Columbina, and 120 elemental mastery to your entire party, provided you are in Ascendant Gleam, which the vast majority of her teams will be. On top of that, you will also give your team a 10% lunar reaction damage bonus, and so overall, it's just a really good supportive set to have in lunar reaction teams. Now, while oftentimes Columbina will be on the one on the set, if it's on someone else in your team, which can sometimes be optimal, and we'll get into examples shortly, then Columbina has a set that is better for her personal damage from off-field, the new Obeyed of Morningstar set. This Morningstar set is kind of the new off-field lunar reaction sub DPS set that will give you 80 EM on the two-piece and 60% lunar reaction damage when you are off-field and inside of Ascendant Gleam. This will obviously almost always be the case, although even without Ascendant Gleam, you still get 20% damage, which isn't useless, but yeah, in almost all of irrelevant teams, you'll get the full 60 and 80 EM, which adds up to being a lot of off-field damage, making it a set that's designed for these off-field sub DPSs. For those reasons, if you already have Silken Moon Serenade somewhere in your team, the Morningstar set can be great for Columbina. Now, in practice, which set is best for her will depend, and generally as a standard support set, Silken Moon Serenade will be the most generalistic option, whereas if you want to maximize her personal damage from off-field, then Morningstar will be the set for that. Now, while I would typically end the discussion there, I want to take it a bit further to give you a bit more clarity. For most generic team building, if Silken Moon Serenade is on a supportive character and you can afford to give Morningstar to your Columbina, then you should. I do want to mention though that in a lot of the current premium teams, this will not be the case. In Flynn's Inefa premium, Inefa will be better off on Morningstar than Columbina because of the fact that she does more damage, unless your Columbina is like more constellated or much higher investment, making giving Silken Moon Serenade to Columbina the standard and Morningstar to Inefa. If, however, you either don't have Inefa there, maybe you're running Fischl on Silken Moon Serenade, or do have Inefa but are running more of a wheelchair team, or a team where your last slot is on Silken Moon Serenade instead, then Morningstar can be used on Columbina as well. Another example is for Lunar Bloom, where, again, standard teams can run Morningstar on Columbina, and this can especially be true if you don't have Lauma, or kind of depending on your substats, it always will be a viable choice. However, if we're talking about being optimal for, say, a premium Nefer team, then a lot of the times it will be better, more overall team damage to give your Columbina a supportive artifact set. Doing this allows you to run, obviously, Nefer on a DPS set, and then either another supportive set on Lauma, or even a more offensive choice for her. In fact, if your last slot is someone on Instructor like Kuki, you can give Silken Moon Serenade to Columbina and Deepwood to Lauma, and that will generally be your best choice. If on the other hand, your last slot is someone like Nahida who can run the Deepwood memory set, then because only one of your supports needs Silken Moon Serenade, while it's viable on either Lauma or Columbina, the best wise choice will actually be to give it to Columbina and give your Llama 2-piece of Elemental Mastery artifact sets in order to maximize her EM and maximize her buffs. Lastly, for Lunar Crystallize, here we're gonna have to wait and see what ZIBAI and Ilua actually do, but from what we know through official sources, if you can run Silk and Moon Serenade on some other support in your team and don't have a sub DPS that does a ton of damage, and it doesn't look like Ilua does that, then Morningstar can be ran on Columbina. Oh, and actually an update here now that we know what Ilua does in game, because he's actually in a world quest this patch, so we can see his whole kit. It does seem like you can only run Silk and Moon Serenade on him efficiently at C2 onwards, where it'll be on him, but if not, it'll be on kind of whatever your 4th slot is if they can run it, or Columbina if not. So it'll depend, but more on that in my ZIBAI guide. For now, just know that Columbina can either be on Morningstar here if someone's on Silk and Moon Serenade, or Silk and Moon Serenade if no one else is on it. Again though, it does really depend from team to team, and the general rule will be for a supportive option, run Silk and Moon Serenade on Columbina, and it'll oftentimes be a good idea. If you already have it on someone else in your team, however, then Morningstar will be the best for her personal damage. Now outside of that, if you want to run Columbina as a main DPS, Night of the Skies Unveiling will be your best, provided you are on field with her, as you'll get 30% crit rate in Ascendant Gleam, lunar reaction damage bonus to your whole team, and 80 elemental mastery. Outside of that, more niche options you can run are Tenacity the Millith in teams with an attack carry where you may not care as much about lunar reaction damage, like with Skirk, because obviously you're not lunar freezing, that doesn't exist yet. So you can slap her on Millith, any supportive weapon, and she can work there as well. Lastly, regarding Deepwood Memories and Instructor, these are sets that Columbina can technically hold and make use of in a Lunar Bloom team, but they will be better off on other characters in your team, with Deepwood Memories obviously being essential to have on one support there. Alright, now next up for the stats you want on Columbina, here's what you need to know. Firstly, in any of her teams that focus around lunar reaction damage, you will need enough energy recharge to use her burst either every rotation or every other rotation, depending on your team and ER requirements. Columbina is a character who will generally burst every rotation, especially if you have an ER weapon that helps alleviate how much energy recharge you need, but if you don't and need too much ER, then in a lot of teams it can be viable and sometimes optimal to burst every other rotation, although this depends on your team, as for example, it's important to burst every rotation in a Nefer Llama team, where you really value the extra do that Columbina's burst gives you. Now, how much energy recharge you need varies drastically from team to team, and also based on which weapon you have, because a lot of her best weapons, like her signature, Prototype Amber, or Favonius, can all lower her energy recharge requirements. Now, with that in mind, I'll put some helpful ER ranges on screen now in order to help you get an idea of how much energy recharge you need for your Columbina for your team, but do note that these are only rough ranges, and the exact amount you need can vary based on the exact team, rotation, and content you're doing. Now, these ER requirements, while they do vary, also assume you're bursting every rotation. How much ER you need varies, so test out what works for you, and a special thanks to MeowTews for what you're seeing on screen. Now, outside of just ER, Columbina also wants HP percent, crit rate, and crit damage. Crit rate and crit damage are going to be your general options to increase all of your damage, and so will HP percent, and also getting enough HP to give your team this lunar damage buff from your passive is going to be quite important. Now, while it caps out at 35,000, so that should be your eventual goal, but if you can't quite make it, it's not worth ruining your artifact quality just to hit it. But yeah, 35,000 HP is going to be a goal, and outside of that, going for crit rate and crit damage will maximize your DPS and be your best substats on every piece. So crit rate, crit damage, HP percent, and energy recharge are the stats you're looking for. I also want to mention that Elemental Mastery isn't a useless substat, but it isn't as good as HP on her because of how much of her kit scales with HP, so EM is not useless, but not as good and not a priority. Now, as you may have noticed, Columbina kind of builds similarly to Farina, both by needing a lot of energy recharge and appreciating crit and HP. Now, main stat wise, it's actually kind of similar. For your Sands, Columbina either wants HP percent or energy recharge, obviously energy recharge if it's needed to reach your ER requirements, which oftentimes can be the case, and if not, HP percent will be better for damage, crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, depending on what you need more of, although be sure to factor in the extra crit rate that Columbina gets from her passive talent, as well as other potential sources like the Night Sky set or Lauma's passive as a DPS. Lastly, for your Goblet, HP percent will be your standard best option, but Hydra damage bonus can be viable as well. Now, generally HP will be better, and that will even more so be the case if you're generally low on HP, but if you are saturated on it and have a lot of sources of HP and can already hit the threshold for your passive, then Hydra damage bonus Goblet in most teams will not be too far behind. Now, the one main exception where a Hydra damage bonus Goblet becomes even more competitive and about as good as HP percent, typically either slightly worse or slightly better, so about as good, is going to be in Lunar Bloom teams. This is because, while generally Columbina does a mix of Hydra damage from her skill and burst and also lunar reaction damage from her skill special hit, which does not scale with damage bonus Goblets, for Lunar Bloom in particular, because of the way her scalings work, a Hydra damage bonus in these Lunar Bloom teams will be very competitive with an HP Goblet, basically choosing between HP or Hydra damage bonus based on your substats. Generally though, an HP Goblet will be your standard and go-to option. Alright, now next up, let's talk about the best weapons for Columbina. Starting things off, we have her signature weapon, Nocturne's Curtain Call. Now this is a weapon made for Columbina that gives her a ton of stats. In fact, you get 88 crit damage from the stat line, and then through the effect you'll gain 10% HP for free, 14 energy here basically once every rotation, as well as another 14% HP and 60% crit damage for lunar reaction damage. If you add all of this up, it will be a total of 148 crit damage, 24% HP, and a nice bonus amount of energy as well. Because of that, you can see that this weapon has an absolute ton of stats. However, as a support character that needs a lot of energy if you plan on using her burst, and someone who also scales with HP, there are a ton of other catalysts that are also really good for Columbina. In fact, while Nocturne's Curtain Call is your best in slot, so if you get it, you should use it, its exact value will vary based on your team and your playstyle, and whether it's worth it or not for you kind of depends. In fact, as an on-field DPS, while its value will be higher than usual, being about a 20 to 25% DPS increase, as a support in a team with a dedicated carry like Flynn's or Nefer, while Nocturne's Curtain Call is still great, it'll typically only be around a 10% team DPS increase because of the fact that Columbina isn't the one doing most of your team's damage. Now, obviously, this depends on a lot of factors, but the point here is that in her supportive playstyle, it isn't as big of an upgrade to other weapons, including a free-to-play one that we're gonna cover that's really strong, as some of the more recent signature weapons that will give the character they're designed for an even bigger increase in damage, or a bigger increase in team DPS overall. I think that it's a great weapon, but there are some amazing alternatives that make it to where you definitely do not need it if you don't want to go out of your way to get it. In fact, there are 3 4-star weapons that I want to talk about primarily. Firstly, there are 2 energy giving weapons. There's Prototype Amber and there's Favonius Codex. Now, Prototype Amber is going to be your best free-to-play option. You can craft and refine this for free, and it's a weapon that'll give you 41% HP, and then an effect that will regen energy for Columbina after she bursts, while also healing all of your party members for a small but noticeable amount. And as a support who wants to use her burst, provided you are playing her in lunar damage focused teams, this weapon is a great choice because of the fact that 1, the energy that it refunds you will lower your energy recharge amounts, as we saw in the last section. 2, the healing that it gives your entire party is a nice bonus, especially because a lot of teams may not have a healer. For example, Flynn's premium team has a shielder, which is nice, don't get me wrong, but having a bit of bonus healing can help with comfort, and it definitely can help in some, for example, healerless Nefer teams or other teams you may be playing, while also giving your Columbina a lot of HP through its stat line that helps with her personal damage and hitting your kind of goal for your passive as well. For all those reasons, Prototype Amber is your go-to free-to-play option and generally one of your best 4-stars, potentially even your best overall. Now, it does depend though, as there are 2 other 4-stars that I mainly want to talk about. Next up is Favonius Codex. Now, this one is a weapon that'll give you even more energy, having energy recharge on the stat line, while also having an effect that lowers your ER requirements further, and that will generate energy for your entire party. Personally, I found this weapon to be especially useful in the Stygian Onslaught, where you start without your energy on any character. For those reasons, Favonius Codex can potentially even be your best in slot, depending on your team, energy recharge amounts, and the content you're doing. And so, which weapon is right for you depends, with both Prototype Amber and Favonius Codex being really great. Now, the next 4-star option I want to mention is actually Sacrificial Jade. This is a battle pass option that gives you an absolute ton of stats, and can sometimes be your second best option overall because of how many stats it gives you. This is a weapon that will give you 36.8 crit rate on the stat line, and then 32% HP and 40 EM at R1, or double that for 64% HP and 80 elemental mastery at R5. Now, this effect you can have good uptime on, you just have to not be on field for longer than 10 seconds, so it's nice for support but can even work as a DPS because you're not charge stacking for that long on her anyways. And while this weapon gives you an absolute massive amount of stats, it does have 2 main problems. Number 1 is that you can very easily overcap on crit rate because it gives you so much. Columbina also ascends with crit rate, so she gets 24% for free on top of also having a passive that gives her 15% more crit rate. And then also, if you're playing her as a main DPS, you might be on the Night Sky set, which gives you another 30% crit rate, at which point you're almost assuredly gonna overcap. Now, obviously, that won't be the case in a supportive team where this weapon is still good, but even then you can run into a different problem, which is that Columbina needs an absolute ton of energy recharge, provided you want to use her burst every rotation. If that's the case, as we saw in the last section, if you're running a weapon that doesn't give you energy, you can need so much ER that it can be very difficult to build. For those reasons, if your team allows you to do so and your ER requirements are too high, you can opt to burst every other rotation with this weapon, which will oftentimes be the case. Sacrificial Jade can give you so much personal damage, so many useful stats, that if you can make it work by getting enough energy recharge and by not overcapping on crit rate by a lot, then it can be your second best stat stick after your signature weapon. You will see this in the weapon ranking later, that it really is a great option, although I do want to emphasize that
that it can be difficult to build around, so it's not for everyone. Columbina therefore has 3 really solid 4-star choices, 2 of which giving you a lot of energy, one giving you more and energy to your whole team, the other giving you more HP, still some energy and a bit of healing to your whole party, and then another giving you just an absolute ton of stats, and it is locked behind the battle pass. I do also want to mention at this point that many 5-star stat sticks will perform similarly to a Sacrificial Jade, so if you have weapons like Nefer, Nevalette, or Mualani's signature weapons, or basically any good crit stat stick, then they can be very viable as well. Other more niche 5-star catalysts that give you EM or HP can be good too. Other weapons I wanted to mention in this section are Wave Riding Whirl for energy recharge and a bunch of HP, especially at high refinement, Dawning Frost if you're playing her as a DPS who's charge hacking, Widsith is also viable, although the attack buff is useless and the elemental damage only buffs a part of her kit, and elemental mastery is nice for her, so it's kind of just a viable option, but not the most recommended or the most consistent, but it can work.
And is honestly a solid choice for a DPS Columbina, just because it's a crit stat stick that can sometimes give you a lot of EM. As a DPS, I also wanted to mention Black Marrow Lantern as a viable free-to-play choice, because you're doing Lunar Bloom damage and are going to be an Ascendant Gleam, provided you run another character from Notcry, so it's viable for a DPS Columbina specifically.
And lastly, Thrilling Tales is an option you can use when purely just trying to support an attack scaling carry like Skirk, or it's also viable even in like a Flint's team, although generally, because of how much energy recharge Columbina will need, a supportive energy weapon like Favonius will be better, but Thrilling Tales with enough energy recharge can be viable as well for the attack buff and HP that it gives you if you level it.
And so with the general info out of the way, you should mostly know what weapon to choose on Columbina, as she has really good weapon options for every type of player. For a visual representation of this, here are a few weapon rankings. Firstly, there will be 2 for a support Columbina, one in a Lunar Charge team and one in Lunar Bloom, but as with every weapon ranking, note that the exact performance of every weapon will vary heavily based on your rotation, artifacts, and just a lot of different factors, so don't refer to it as like an exact absolute truth, but it's good to know roughly where each weapon ranks in case you're curious. As I mentioned though, Columbina's signature will be her best, followed by weapons such as Favonius Codex, Prototype Amber, and solid stat sticks like Sacrificial Jade, and most 5-star stat sticks as well. Keep in mind that your exact mileage will vary based on how much ER you need and stuff like that, as well as some other supportive benefits that certain weapons can give you, like her signature, Favonius Codex, and Prototype Amber. Also, while Thrilling Tales is viable in a Flint's team, obviously it'll be a lot worse if your main DPS doesn't scale with attack. Additionally, if you are playing in a team where Columbina either doesn't need her burst, is bursting every other rotation, or just doesn't need much energy recharge, then naturally the ER weapons will go down in value, and crit stat sticks like Sacrificial Jade and others will be more valuable, so do keep that in mind. Lastly, here's a weapon ranking for a main DPS Columbina, with similar weapons still being great, and some other new contenders also being strong choices as well, once again depending on many factors. And a huge thanks to MeowTews for all the calculations and rankings shown.
Alright, now next up for Columbina's constellations, here's what you need to know. First of all, each constellation Columbina has will elevate all of your party members' lunar reaction damage by a little bit. 1.5% for C1, 3, 4, and 5, and 7% for C2 and 6. Elevation is basically just a separate multiplier, so it'll increase your lunar damage by that amount, which is a nice added bonus. Now for each constellation though, here's what you need to know. Firstly, for Columbina C1, when you use her elemental skill, it will trigger a hit equivalent of the gravity interference effect, so it'll be a hit of lunar reaction damage. Outside of that, every time Columbina triggers gravity interference, there will be some form of a buff, either recovering 6 energy to your active character if it's lunar charge, giving interruption resistance if it's lunar bloom, or summoning a rain sea shield based on Columbina's HP if it's lunar crystallize. All 3 of these are nice for quality of life. The shield in general is cool, especially because lunar crystallize doesn't give you a shield that regular crystallize does, so it can kind of make up for it there if you're not running a healer or shielder. The interruption resistance in lunar bloom is okay in general, but I'd say mostly nice for a carry Columbina who doesn't have interruption resistance, more so than with someone like Nefer who's dashing around a lot, meaning that she'll oftentimes have iframes during her rotation, and the bonus energy in lunar charge is always nice. Overall though, this constellation provides you with a lot of quality of life, an extra hit of lunar damage, and a bit of lunar reaction elevation, making it an okay constellation, but not all that great, especially when compared to her next constellation. In fact, Columbina C2 does a lot. It'll firstly increase the rate of accumulating gravity by 34%, basically giving you an extra hit per rotation. Outside of that, you will also get a 40% max HP increase to your Columbina, and then you will also give a buff to your active character based on the lunar reaction type you're triggering with your gravity interference. If it's lunar charge, your active character will gain attack, defense if it's lunar crystallize, or elemental mastery if it's lunar bloom. The amount you gain will scale on Columbina's max HP, and overall it'll just be a really nice and helpful increase in stats to your active character for the stat that they typically will need for that reaction. Attack is great for lunar charge carries, same with elemental mastery for lunar bloom ones, and for lunar crystallize, while we don't have any, this constellation giving defense basically confirms that ZIBAI will be a defense scaling character, so I assume this will be very nice nice for her. Because of all of these factors,
While Columbina's first constellation isn't that big of a DPS increase, her second one will be around a 20 to 30% team DPS increase.
it's still not something you need, don't feel forced to get it, but it is definitely her best early stopping point, and I'd say most valuable constellation overall. It's nice for her team damage and also her personal damage too. Next up, Columbina's C3 and 5 increase her talent levels, C3 increasing her skills level, and C5 increasing her burst level, which are both okay. And then Columbina's C4 will give her a lot of energy, 4 per gravity interference cast, which adds up and lowers her energy recharge requirements, and she will also, once every 15 seconds, increase the damage of 1 instance of her gravity interference hits. Lastly, Columbina's C6 will be an 80% crit damage increase to lunar reaction damage for the whole team when they're inside of her elemental burst's lunar domain. This is a pretty simple and universal buff to lunar reaction damage, obviously synergizing with a lot of her teams and Nodcry carries, and being a constellation that buffs her own damage as well, but it does seem to be more of a supportive constellation, kind of similarly to all of her constellations that help her as a DPS, but I'd say amplify all of your team and are really kind of supportive constellations where they do become more valuable. I'd say that constellation-wise, do not feel forced like you need any. C2 is the best early one if you want to get any, but even at C0, she is a great character that feels complete and that you can be happy with. Now lastly, because it is tradition to cover C1 versus R1, so a character's first constellation or their signature as to which one you should get, for Columbina, it's a bit weird because both C1 and R1 are pretty similar. R1 can be a bit better for personal damage. It does depend on your team though. C1 can sometimes be better for team damage, and it also gives you a lot of like convenience through a shield or interruption resistance. But the real answer here is that it does depend, right, on your team, but also on what you're going for. Columbina's signature weapon, while it is not needed for her because she does have some great free-to-play options that can help, for example, give her a lot of energy. If you want a stat stick on your account that gives a lot of crit damage that you can even use on other characters, then it can be favored. But honestly, because C2 is such a big upgrade and such a better constellation than her first one, getting C1 in my opinion is more valuable because it gets you closer to C2 if it's something that you eventually want to get. Now again, it does depend on a lot of things and don't feel like you need constellations, but as far as vertical investment goes, in my mind it's either C2 or C0. Her signature weapon honestly gains value after C2, and in general it's kind of similar to C1 in value, so you can kind of make your decision there based on the factors that I mentioned. But yeah, personally I would prefer the constellation, although having 5-star weapons on your account can be nice if you don't have many. Alright, now next up, let's talk about one of the most important sections of the video, Columbina's best teams and synergies. Now Columbina, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is a character that synergizes really well with every single Nodcry 5-star and can elevate their teams to being at the top of the meta. With that in mind, she can also work as a generic Hydro sub DPS in other teams where, yeah, there's other options, but she can work if you want her or already have her. And so with that in mind, let's get into it. Firstly, Columbina is an upgrade to Flynn's team, being the new best in slot Hydro option for a Flynn's premium team, which is honestly incredible. In teams like this, Columbina will be a much better Hydro slot than I know, greatly increasing your team's overall damage, with both Inefa and Columbina doing a big chunk of your team's damage, on top of Flynn's being the on-field carry. Now, because of the fact that not just Flynn's, but also Inefa and Columbina are doing a lot of damage, the optimal rotation that has been found, at least as of right now, is to actually swap into Sucrose, your last slot, more often, kind of before and after Flynn's, so swapping back into her, to re-swirl Hydro and Electro and increase the damage of your sub DPSs on top of Flynn's. With that in mind, the last slot here is flexible. You can use other characters, but Sucrose is generally the go-to. Yehoda can work too as a healer, who gets a lot better, most notably at C6 thanks to her buffs. Now outside of that, Inefa, Columbina, Flynn's, and Sucrose is the premium. If you don't have Inefa though, you can still play her with Flynn's alongside another Electro and a flexible last slot. Fischl and Sucrose here will give you the Hexarai resonance and really high damage, but you won't have a healer, so you can run a defensive Anemo option like Yehoda or Lanyan, or even a Electro healer, something like that. But yeah, basically she works well with Flynn's, and you can refer to my Flynn's guide if you want more detailed team options. But also I wanted to mention that for a team like this, Inefa would be a bigger upgrade than Columbina if you're just getting one 5-star, but both Inefa and Columbina are a part of Flynn's best teams, and it's a similar situation with getting Llama for Nefer and then Columbina afterwards. Columbina is naturally a part of Nefer's best team, giving you huge buffs to the Lunar Bloom reaction, having good personal damage, and also giving you extra Verdant Dew, which makes your rotation a lot smoother. In this team, Llama can actually hold her elemental skill during the setup of your rotation because of the fact that you get 3 extra special Dew from Columbina, and you're constantly generating more. Before Columbina, you'd have to just tap E on Llama to save all your Dews for Nefer, but Columbina allows you to hold your skill on Llama and then also not have to wait on Nefer, provided you are kind of rotating properly. For your last slot in this team, it is very flexible, with my favorite options being either Nahida, Kuki, or Sucrose. The artifact sets of your exact characters will vary, and I covered more about that in the artifact set section of this video, but basically everyone here will give you a lot of value. Keep in mind that if your last slot isn't a healer and you don't have C1 Llama, you may want to heavily consider Prototype Amber to give you some form of healing. Otherwise, your last slot can be a healer like Kuki. Outside of that, Columbina will also also naturally work with ZIBAI alongside Ilua. And now while we don't know exactly what they'll do, we know that ZIBAI is a lunar crystallized carry, and so Columbina will naturally synergize very well in that type of team. Now outside of just the premium Natlan teams, what else can you do with these lunar reactions that Columbina enables? Well, firstly, for lunar crystallized, Columbina can be an upgrade to a lot of Geo teams. She can work with basically any Geo carry or sub DPS, enabling you to get just a free bonus reaction thanks to lunar crystallized. She can work well with Navia, like in this example double Hydro team, or she can even work with other carries like Ito, Noelle, or sub DPSs like Shiori, Albedo, or Zhongli. Now, if you don't have the Nodcry carries and only have a sub DPS like Inefa or Llama, what should you do? Well, firstly, as I touched on in my last video, Columbina and Inefa will be the new premium duo at carrying almost any single team or any DPS. In fact, Columbina and Inefa will buff their lunar charge damage so much, mostly thanks to Columbina, although Inefa has a bit of buffs, and then also do great personal damage from off field. Again, a bit more from Inefa, but still a lot from Columbina too, in a way that can carry almost any DPS to meta relevancy. On top of that, it'll also perform very well at defeating certain lunar shield mechanics or enemies that have a lunar shield or are weak to lunar reactions that can give you an alternative way of playing a strong team. For example, while Mawika Sitlali is still going to be Mawika's best team, against certain bosses, running Columbina and Inefa with her can help you kind of break through a shield faster. Now, obviously, Mawika's an insane DPS who doesn't need the carrying, but for a lot of worse characters, Columbina and Inefa can do all of the heavy lifting and make them viable. Now, while I'll name a few, I really can't name everyone that works here because literally almost any carry in the game can work. Some of my favorites that I've tested though, to name a few, are like Raiden, Clorind, Aoife, Arlecchino, Hu Tao, Chaska, and Navia, but again, literally any carry can work. Additionally, you can even run a bunch of sub DPSs and have a strong team here, like running Columbina, Inefa, and Sucrose, which in my last video I showed off clearing the Spiral Abyss without even a last slot, although admittedly the enemy was weak to lunar charge, but I even cleared floor 12 with just a 3, and even a team with Durin here and Shilonin, or a flexible last slot, can work really well too. And so yeah, anyone works here. And I do want to mention that when you are playing Columbina and Inefa with any carry, that DPS can run the Night of the Skies Unveiling set for 30 crit rate and 80 EM if they don't have a better option, because you are constantly doing these lunar reactions from your supports. So whoever's wearing the set, provided they are on field, will get the crit rate, and it can be the best option for a lot of carries. Outside of that, if you do have Lauma available but no Nefer, you can play a team with Columbina as a surprisingly strong and in my opinion underrated great main DPS that can consume the Verdant Dews to use her unique charge attacks from on field. Lauma is a huge buff to Columbina here. If you don't have her, you can still play Columbina DPS, but Lauma will be her best support, and the other slots will be flexible. Having another Hydro can be nice for elemental application and helping a lot with your energy, and if you have enough available, you can run her here, but any flex slot can work, like even Sucrose. Nilu teams also work, and so does Durin if you have him available, but here make sure to actually get enough Hydro, either by swirling it with Sucrose or running another Hydro unit. I'm sure you can run a lot of different teams here. These are just some examples, but Columbina Lauma is truly a great duo.
If you don't have Llama and still want to play Columbina as a carry, then you can use another Dendro option, although they will be worse, like Nahida, Kole, or others. In a team like this, you can use another Hydro to lower your ER requirements, give you the Hydro resonance, and also get more elemental application, which is great, and another character who can help trigger reactions. For example, you can run Kuki if you don't have Inefa to trigger some Hyper Blooms, and obviously if you have Inefa, use her. And your last slot can be another Hydro character, with Aino being a great choice to enable Ascendant Gleam, provided you don't have a second Nodcry character.
I will say that she can kind of always be ran as an on-field 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling holder, just for a bunch of crit rate. If you are an Ascendant Gleam and don't have a good DPS, or no one really to use on field, then that will be an option you can consider. Outside of that, I did want to mention that with Llama, you can also support certain carries like Alhaitham, Sino, or a few others that want Dendro and Hydro. Outside of that, Columbina can be ran in a lot of like generic teams. You can play her in Hyper Bloom, either off-field or on-field, depending on your last slot. You can be in some soup or taser teams that focus around just spamming a bunch of reactions. You can use her in almost any team, just as a good off-field Hydro applier, even when she doesn't have the most synergy. For example, in a Skirk team, while Lunar Freeze isn't a reaction, at least not yet, who knows if it'll come in the future, you can use Columbina just for her skill, Tenacity the Millith, Thrilling Tales, and just through that, she'll be good enough to be a viable option in a team like this. Now, obviously, I wouldn't go out of my way to pull for Columbina for like a Skirk team, but it is another viable way to use Columbina if you have her and want to use her. With that said, we're trying to focus on the most optimal synergies and recommended teams to play, so that's why I don't want to talk about it too much, but it is viable, and I think it's important to know that if you just want to use her here, you definitely can, and she definitely will work. As a recap though, Columbina works great for all the lunar reactions, great with Flynn's, Nefer, ZIBAI, Inefa, and Lauma, and in generic lunar crystallized teams she can work as well, and then in other teams she can just be a solid off-field Hydro, or even on-field under the right conditions. Alright, now with that out of the way, I'm gonna get into a team showcase of my Columbina in just a few of her best teams. Now for a more complete showcase, check out my last video, but for now, I want to include an updated
updated one in the first half of the Spiral Abyss, the one without the lunar damage buff, so it's more fair, showing her off as a support in Flynn's teams, Nefer teams, and Lunar Crystallize with Navia because ZIBAI isn't out yet. Oh, and there will also be one bonus clip in the second half with a lunar damage bonus buff, just because. As I said, this is a team DPS showcase, so my Columbina is on a support or sub DPS build. She's on Silkenwood Serenade with Flynn's and Nefer, and I did switch to a Morning Star build for the Navia team specifically. With that said, my stats are pretty similar. As you can see, I have a pretty good crit ratio and also enough energy recharge for the teams I'm playing on Prototype Amber, which is a 4-star free-to-play weapon. My Columbina is also talent level 8-8, with definitely some room for improvement here. It's just a new weekly boss, and I recorded these showcase clips in the first week, despite this video somehow coming out much later. And so yeah, here's a C0 team showcase for my Columbina in a few different teams. I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, overall I think Columbina is a great character, especially if you have at least one other good Nodcry unit to pair with her, with my exact thoughts on her kit and my feelings about her being recapped in my last video. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the guide, and I would like to apologize because I know this is like my latest guide ever. There's some unfortunate timings IRL that made this guide way more delayed than it should have been, but I'll try to be back on my feet for ZIBAI and the next characters and more on time for the future patches. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope it was worth the wait as a lot of effort went into it. If there's anything you want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.